When I went out of town, my neighbor faked a lease and rented my house on Craigslist, made $4K, and said finders keepers, sucker when I confronted him. So while cleaning up after strangers, I found his bank statement in my trash and forwarded it to the IRS. When I pulled into my driveway that Sunday night, I thought I had the wrong house. There were cars parked in my yard, kids' bikes on the porch, and when I unlocked the front door, a woman screamed. "Who the hell are you?" she shouted, clutching a frying pan. I froze. "Who am I? This is my house." Turns out, she and her husband had just moved in 3 days ago. They'd rented my house off Craigslist for $1,400 a month. They even had a printed lease, complete with fake signatures, and my name typed on top. I was gone for 3 weeks visiting my sister in Florida. My neighbor, Rick, was supposed to water my plants and collect my mail. Instead, he apparently decided my absence was an opportunity. When I stormed over to his house that night, he didn't even look nervous. He leaned against his fence, smirking, holding a beer. "Hey man, I see you met your new tenants," he said like it was a joke. "What the hell did you do, Rick?" I asked. He shrugged. "I just helped some folks find a place." "You weren't using it. Figured I'd make a little something for my time." "You rented my house," I shouted. He took a sip, totally calm. "Finders keepers, sucker." Then he walked back inside. I stood there shaking. The renters were innocent. I could tell they'd been scammed too. They showed me everything. The fake listing, the deposit receipt, even text messages from a prepaid number that turned out to be his. By the next morning, I was on the phone with the police, a lawyer, and my insurance company, trying to prove that I actually own my own house. It was chaos. But that wasn't even the worst part. A few days later, while cleaning up the trash the fake tenants left behind, I found something that made my stomach drop, a torn bank statement in my garbage bin. It had Rick's name on it, his account number, and a deposit that matched exactly what the tenants had paid. That's when I knew he wasn't just being greedy. He was running a full scam, and mine wasn't the first house he'd done it to. And that bank statement, I wasn't about to throw it away, because I knew exactly who to forward it to next. Rick moved in next door 2 years before everything blew up. At first, I thought he was just one of those laid-back, slightly obnoxious neighbors. The kind who borrowed tools and returned them months later, who blasted music in the garage, but waved like you were best friends. I tried to be friendly. We lived in a quiet neighborhood in Garland, Texas. The kind of place where people mow their lawns on Saturdays and complain about the HOA in the same breath. I'd bought my house 10 years earlier, poured a lot into fixing it up, new deck, solar panels, small vegetable garden out back. It was home. Rick was different. Mid-40s, divorced, self-employed. He said he flipped cars and did consulting, which was code for something sketchy. But I didn't judge, not at first. It started small. He'd ask if I could watch for packages when he was out of town. Then he'd forget to pick them up for weeks. He once borrowed my ladder and left it out in the rain, rusting. And when I mentioned it, he laughed it off, saying, "Relax, man, you've got money." I didn't realize then that Rick was sizing people up all the time, seeing who was careful, who was trusting, who wouldn't fight back. Our first real argument happened 6 months before the scam. His dog tore through my garden and destroyed half my tomato plants. I brought it up calmly, just asked him to keep the dog on a leash. He rolled his eyes and said, "You act like you own the block." That line stuck with me. You act like you own the block. When I had to leave for 3 weeks to take care of my sister after her surgery, Rick offered to check my mail and water the plants. "I'll make sure your kingdom doesn't burn down while you're gone," he joked. I thought it was his dumb sense of humor. I should have known better. The weirdest thing was, a week before I left, I saw him taking photos of my house. He said he was just showing his cousin how sweet my setup was because they were thinking of renovating theirs. I believed him. That photo ended up being the cover picture on the Craigslist ad. When I put everything together, the photos, the finders keepers comment, and the timing, it hit me like a brick. This wasn't some impulsive move. Rick had planned it while pretending to be helpful. And I wasn't the only one he'd burned. Because while I was filing my police report, the officer mentioned another complaint from across town. A woman had reported being scammed by a man using the same fake name, R. Callahan. Rick's last name, Callahan. It wasn't random. He had a system. And when I looked at that torn bank statement again later that night, something else caught my eye, a payment from a name I recognized. Someone I knew. Someone who shouldn't have been paying him anything. That's when I realized Rick hadn't done this alone. The name on the bank statement stopped me cold. J. Dalton. That was Julie Dalton, my real estate agent when I first bought the house 10 years ago, and someone I still talk to occasionally. We weren't close friends, but we'd run into each other at community events. I'd even sent her referrals. Why the hell was her name tied to Rick's account? At first, I told myself it had to be a coincidence. Maybe she'd sold him a car or it was a payment for something legitimate. But something in my gut said otherwise, so I called her. She answered on the second ring, chipper as always. "Hey, stranger. How's the house holding up?" I tried to keep my voice steady. "It's fine. Actually, I need to ask you something. Did you recently send money to a guy named Rick Callahan?" Silence, just the faint sound of her breathing. Then she said, can I call you back?" and hung up. That was all I needed to know. 2 hours later, a white SUV rolled up in front of my house, Julie's. She got out, sunglasses on, looking nervous as hell. I was standing in my driveway waiting. "Julie," I said, crossing my arms. "What's going on?" She glanced around before whispering, "You can't tell anyone I was involved. I didn't know he'd actually rent your place. He said he was helping you sell it off market while you were gone." I felt my jaw drop. "Sell it? Are you kidding me?" She looked panicked. "He showed me an email, said you wanted to offload it quietly. He even had a fake POA form with your name on it. I sent him a consulting fee for helping me line up buyers. I swear, I didn't know." That's when I realized this wasn't just about a rental scam. Rick was trying to sell my damn house out from under me. The fake lease was just phase one. He'd been testing how far he could go. I went inside and started digging through every document, every text, every email I had from him. I found one that made me feel sick, a message from him while I was in Florida saying, "Don't stress about the mail, I'll forward anything important." Except he hadn't forwarded it. He'd opened it. Because now, missing from my home office was my mortgage statement, utility bills, and even an old copy of my property deed. He had everything he needed to impersonate me. When I told the police, they said they'd add it to the file. That was it. No urgency, no real help, so I started my own paper trail. I gathered the fake lease, the Craigslist listing, screenshots from the prepaid number, even the tenant's payment receipts. I documented everything, but Rick wasn't backing down. The next morning, I found my mailbox ripped open, my car scratched, and a note taped to my door. "You should have stayed in Florida." That was the moment I stopped being scared. I was done cleaning up his mess. I was done waiting for someone else to fix it. Rick thought he was clever, untouchable. But I was about to show him what happens when you scam the wrong neighbor. A week after the note appeared on my door, I finally got a call from Detective Alvarez, the one handling my case. He said he had updates. I drove to the precinct thinking maybe they'd found enough to arrest Rick. Instead, Alvarez slid a folder across the table and said, "You're not gonna like this." Inside were printed screenshots, Craigslist messages, fake emails, transaction records, all tied to the scam. But one of the email addresses stopped me dead. m.callahan84@gmail.com, Rick's wife. Or technically, ex-wife. I thought she'd been out of the picture for years. But apparently, they were still talking and working together. She was the one running the Craigslist listings, pretending to be the owner. She even handled the fake lease paperwork, using the same templates from her old property management job. And then Alvarez said something that made my stomach drop. "Thing is, your neighbor isn't just some idiot trying to make a quick buck. We think he's been running this scheme across multiple properties in the Fort Worth area. 3 confirmed, maybe more. He and his ex split the profits. She finds the renters. He poses as the contact." I sat there speechless. "So, what happens now?" I asked. Alvarez sighed. "We're building the case. But unless you've got more direct proof, like him admitting it or something that ties him personally to your property, it's gonna take time." That's when I remembered the bank statement in my trash. I told him about it and he said, "Keep that safe, that's gold." But later that night, when I went to retrieve it from my lockbox, it was gone. I tore the house apart, nothing. I checked my camera footage, and there it was, Rick, around 2 a.m., sneaking onto my porch with a flashlight and gloves. He must have picked the lock or somehow gotten a key. I couldn't prove what he took, but I knew. And then came the gut punch. The next morning, I got an email from my own mortgage company. They said there'd been an inquiry about transferring ownership of my property to a new buyer. They were verifying that I'd initiated it. The name listed under the inquiry, Julie Dalton, my agent. She wasn't just a clueless bystander. She'd gone back to Rick. I called her over and over, no answer. Finally, I sent her one message. You picked the wrong side. An hour later, my phone buzzed. Unknown number, a text. Drop it, you have no proof left. Attached was a photo me, standing in my driveway, taken that morning from across the street. Rick was watching me. That's when I stopped being the victim. If they wanted proof, I was going to give them something they couldn't erase. Because I still had one trick left, and it involved the last thing they'd ever expect, his own bank. I didn't sleep for 2 nights. I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of printouts, my laptop, and a trash bag full of the junk the fake tenants left behind. I felt like the whole neighborhood had been turned into a stage, and I was the only one who hadn't read the script. Rick and Julie thought they'd scared me into silence. They'd made one fatal mistake. They underestimated how petty and stubborn I am when something is mine. First thing I did was call every number on that torn bank statement. It was thin evidence, but it was his handwriting on a note taped to the back of it, the account nickname he used, the memo line that matched a deposit from the renters. I called the bank's fraud line and pretended to be the account holder's annoyed spouse. The person I spoke to was polite and boringly procedural. They asked me to fax a copy of any supporting docs. I already had the document scanned. I sent it. I also sent the same files to the email the mortgage company used for fraud reports. I signed both with my real name. That made me feel a little less helpless. Then I did something that felt mean and necessary. I got the renters on my side. They were devastated and embarrassed. They didn't want to be publicly humiliated, but they wanted their money back. I promised to handle the ugly parts if they'd cooperate. I asked them to keep everything, texts, receipts, the fake lease, the email threads. They agreed. They hated Rick as much as I did now. We made a list of everything he'd touched in the house. Rugs, curtains, a ripped screen door he claimed needed replacing, the washer he'd fixed. Document everything, I told them. Take photos. The more mundane the evidence, the more it proves he wasn't some impulsive idiot, he was systematic. Next, paper trails. I printed every single Craigslist screenshot, every incoming message to the prepaid number, every ad with my house pictures. I compiled a timeline. Photos taken, ads posted, deposits received. I cross-referenced timestamps with the camera footage that showed Rick snooping on my porch. The pattern was ugly and precise, like a stencil. I color-coded it and taped it to the wall in front of me like a crazy person. It made me feel organized instead of violated. The other piece was leverage. I still had one hard copy he couldn't deny, that bank statement. It went missing from my lockbox, but not before I scanned it, printed 12 copies, and hid one in places he'd never think to look. I forwarded an encrypted copy to the bank's fraud compliance email, to the county recorder who handles property transfers, and to my own lawyer with a subject line that said, simply, fraud evidence enclosed. I didn't threaten or name-call. I documented. Then I pulled a social move. I wrote a neutral, fact-only email to Julie's broker, not accusatory, just the timeline and copies of the documents that tied her name to the inquiry. I used language that made lawyers sit up. Potentially fraudulent transfer inquiry, please advise. That email landed in someone's inbox at her firm, and I could imagine the tiny alarm lights going off. I didn't want to ruin her career. I wanted her to be afraid to feel the heat. Finally, I set the bait. I created a disposable email and a fake Craigslist listing for a courteous, non-committal weekend tenant who would pay a refundable deposit. The renters agreed to respond and record everything. Their deposit would be a traceable prepaid card that I controlled. I wasn't going to send money to anyone, not yet, but I wanted Rick to think someone else was baiting him, to make him show his hand. I stood back and looked at the wall. The plan wasn't pretty. It was cold, bureaucratic, and boring, paperwork, evidence chains, and channels. But it was hard to erase, and that's what would make it lethal. I had no illusions this would be clean. I expected threats, slashed tires, late-night visits. What I didn't expect was that when I checked my email at 2:12 a.m., there was a message from a number I didn't recognize with one line and an attachment. It was a photograph of the copy of the bank statement, the exact one I'd forwarded, and the caption read, "Nice try. You should have destroyed that, not copied it." I thought the photograph at 2:12 am was as far as they'd go with the intimidation. I was wrong. 3 nights after that message, someone slid an unmarked envelope under my door. No note, just a cheap USB drive wrapped in a single square of paper towel. My first instinct was to call the cops, the same cops who told me to file it, but I'd already learned they weren't reliable. So I took it inside, locked the doors, and put it in my laptop. What I found made me nauseous. The USB contained 3 things: a short video, a folder of audio files, and a single PDF labeled in sloppy handwriting, "Backup just in case." The video showed Rick and Julie in the Lowe's parking lot, whispering into a recorder. The camera angle was shaky, but the audio was clear. Their voices planning deposit times, the prepaid number, how to stage the lease. That was bad enough, proof they coordinated. But the audio files were the thing that made my blood run cold. One clip was Rick on the phone, calm and clipped. He said, "Alvarez will handle the paperwork once the inquiry drops. We give him 10%, cover of cash, and he moves the county hold." Another clip was Julie, talking to someone I didn't recognize. "Detective Alvarez wants clean lines. He'll make the transfer look like a buyer verification. He says the bank will need to see a willing seller email. We'll provide it." Then a new voice cut in, lower, smoother, unmistakable. "Make sure the deposits hit an account we can't trace back to us. I'll wipe my prints." It was Detective Alvarez. I watched the files 3 times. I listened to the way his voice softened when he said, "wipe my prints," as if he was describing a mechanic, not a crime. He sounded bored, like it was paperwork and not someone's life. I felt like somebody had opened up a cabinet under my sink and found rats living inside. I didn't know who dropped the USB. Part of me wanted to laugh at the idea that some anonymous Samaritan had handed me the smoking gun, but that didn't matter. The point was the evidence existed. The detective assigned to my case was on the tape, taking bribes, coordinating with Rick and Julie, and planning to use the county system to launder ownership. I panicked and did the only thing that made sense. I made duplicates. I uploaded every file to 3 separate cloud storages, emailed encrypted copies to my lawyer, and printed waveforms with timestamps. My lawyer called me within the hour. Her voice was tight. "This changes everything. Don't let anyone know you have these. If Alvarez gets a heads up, he'll bury the files." I thought of Alvarez's eyes the day he handed me the folder at the precinct, tired, sympathetic. He'd looked like someone who'd seen uglier crimes and had better things to do. He wasn't a man who looked like he'd accept bribes. That's the thing with monsters in plain clothes. They look exactly like your expectations until you see them naked. For the first time, the threat felt national, not personal. This wasn't a dumb neighbor with a grudge. This was a small, crooked machine, a cop who could stall investigations, a broker willing to risk her license, and a neighbor who knew how to sneak in and out of houses. Together, they had the power to make my home disappear on paper. I knew 2 things with brutal clarity. I couldn't go to the precinct, and I couldn't keep this to myself. So I did the only reckless, obvious move I hadn't yet tried. I printed the key audio excerpt with Alvarez's voice, put it inside an envelope, and addressed it to the county attorney's fraud division. No subject line, no explanation, just the words, "For immediate investigation, evidence enclosed." I slid it into the outgoing mail slot at the post office, hands shaking so badly I thought I'd contaminate the tape. If this was a house of small-time thieves, I'd just thrown a Molotov through the living room window. And then my phone buzzed. Unknown number again. The message was a single line and a time-stamped screenshot of the envelope I'd just mailed, the postmark, the county fraud division's address, the date. "You're playing a dangerous game. Stop now, or next time it won't be just your house to lose." The sender was Detective Alvarez. I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred. They weren't just willing to steal my house. They were willing to scare me into silence, and they had the resources to do it. The only question left was why they'd go this far. When my lawyer finally called again, her tone was flat, like she'd been sitting with something heavy for a while. "Sit down," she said. "You're not going to like what I found." She dug deeper into Rick's financials, using the copy of his account info I'd sent earlier. The deposit from the fake tenants wasn't a one-off. There were multiple transfers, small amounts coming in from names tied to properties that had been foreclosed in our county. Same pattern. Always a rental scam or a lease-to-own scam, always just before a foreclosure notice hit. But that wasn't the real horror. The audio files from the USB made sense now. Alvarez wasn't covering for Rick because he was desperate for money. He was feeding him leads. When banks filed foreclosure or lien paperwork, the first step went through the sheriff's office. Alvarez had access to those addresses before anyone else did. He'd send them to Rick and his ex. They'd post fake listings, collect deposits, and vanish before the legitimate owners or the bank even knew. They used people's pain as a business model. And Rick had used me as a test case, a proof of concept, his exact words in one of the transcripts. That line was buried in the last audio file my lawyer decrypted. Rick's voice, bragging, "If I can flip the neighbor's place and make it stick, I can do it to anyone. Guy's too nice to fight back." The silence that followed in that clip was Alvarez's voice, low and cold. "Then make it stick. Paperwork's power. Once the ink's in the system, he doesn't exist." That's when it clicked. They weren't after my house because it was convenient, they picked me because I'd never think to suspect it, because I'd trusted him. Because my property was in good standing and my mail piled up when I left town. It wasn't random cruelty, it was precision. I was the pilot project for a fraud ring run by a cop. The worst part, Julie knew exactly what was happening. Her brokerage wasn't innocent. They handled the shell paperwork for the buyers in exchange for consulting fees. She wasn't dumb. She just thought they'd never get caught because the records would look legitimate once Alvarez filed them through official channels. When my lawyer finished explaining, I sat there staring at the phone, feeling like the floor had gone soft. Rick had bragged once that paper doesn't bleed. Now I understood what he meant. They could erase people without ever touching them. My house was just the start, and if they'd gotten away with it, the next family on that foreclosure list would have lost everything. So yeah, I was scared. But fear stopped being useful. I didn't just want them arrested. I wanted the system that protected them to crack under the weight of its own cover-up. And I had one last card left to play, the one thing they hadn't counted on. The USB hadn't come from a stranger. The person who dropped it off was closer to them than any of us realized. The person who dropped off the USB turned out to be Rick's own ex-wife, Melissa. The one I'd assumed was helping him. She called me from a blocked number a few days after the fraud division received my anonymous package. Her voice was low, almost whispering. "I didn't do it for you," she said. "I did it to burn him before he burned me." Turns out, Rick had promised her half of the profits from the scams, but Alvarez had started pushing her out of the loop. They were planning to cut her off completely, maybe even frame her if anything went public. She'd panicked and dumped the USB at my house, hoping I'd make enough noise to bury them all. I didn't care about her reasons. I cared that I finally had leverage. I told my lawyer everything. She put me in touch with a state investigator who wasn't connected to the local precinct, someone who specialized in internal affairs. He asked for the files, the recordings, the timestamps, everything. He didn't promise me anything, just said, "Keep your doors locked, don't tell anyone else." For 2 weeks, nothing happened. The waiting almost broke me. My job suffered. My friends stopped visiting because they were tired of seeing me glued to a laptop. Then one Thursday morning, at exactly 7:43 a.m., it all hit at once. Marked cars pulled up to Rick's house. 3 unmarked sedans followed. I watched from behind my curtains as agents walked him out in cuffs. Julie's office downtown got raided the same day. Later that afternoon, I heard Alvarez was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. That's bureaucratic talk for they caught him dirty. The fraud division called me in the next week to give a formal statement. When they showed me some of the recovered files, it was worse than I imagined. Nearly a dozen properties, some elderly homeowners, some people overseas, all victims. The fake paperwork chain was professional. Rick wasn't a small-time con, he was part of a minor organized ring. They used his charm and Alvarez's badge to make everything look legitimate. When the news finally broke in the Dallas Morning News, my name wasn't mentioned, just local homeowners' evidence leads to multi-county fraud bust. That was fine by me. I didn't need fame, I just needed to sleep again. The renters who'd been duped got their money back through restitution. The bank dropped every fraudulent inquiry tied to my property, and my lawyer helped me lock down everything: new locks, new monitoring, frozen credit. Rick's house sat empty for weeks after the arrest. Eventually, a repo team came and hauled away his furniture. The irony wasn't lost on me. For once, someone else was cleaning up his mess. A month later, I got a plain envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single line on notebook paper: "You really should have stayed in Florida." No signature. But this time I didn't feel fear, just disgust. I burned it in the sink. The next morning, I planted new tomatoes in the garden Rick's dog had ruined years ago. The yard was quiet. For the first time in months, my house actually felt like mine again. As I locked up that night, I looked over at Rick's dark, empty driveway and couldn't help smiling a little. People like him always think paperwork and lies make them untouchable. But they forget paper burns. And I was done being polite enough to put out the fire.